Lester, Wushu engineer. Weapons. What benefit do they give us in terms of their use? Now, if you asked anyone, and if you asked the average person in the street, how much force does a weapon produce as opposed to a barehand strike, or a punch, or a kick, for that matter? And the average person would assume that the weapon would produce more force, impact force. Well, we're going to have a look at that today. We're going to test that and see whether it's true or not. Now, I'm using as a reference one of my previous videos in which I did a backfist, and I'll put the link in the description below, or you could trawl through my videos and find it, in which I do a backfist against our load cell. And I'm going to be using the same load cell to test weapon strikes, and I'm going to be using a similar type of kinetic chain to produce impact force and energy when I'm using the weapons that I've chosen to use today. And the two weapons I've chosen to use are the flute. This is quite a heavy version of a traditional Chinese flute. Traditionally, the flute would actually be a flute, perhaps made out of bamboo, and it would be hollow and therefore very fragile. And yet it could still be employed as a very effective weapon in the right hands. This is a very heavy and very robust flute. This is about 800 grams, so fairly heavy, hardwood pole, roughly 800 mils long. And as a comparison, I'm going to be also doing some of the similar strikes using an Indian club, which I have in my possession. I've got several sets of them. I use them for the various Indian club swinging exercises. They're really good auxiliary or peripheral set of exercises that I use to get circular motion into the wrists, shoulders, elbows, etc. Some people specialize, obviously, in Indian clubs. It's not my specialty, but I do use them from time to time. This weighs just over 600 grams. But the weight is more concentrated at one point. It's shorter too. So we'll test those two against the load cell. I've put some additional padding on the load cell so that it doesn't get damaged, and that's primarily the reason that I'm using these two weapons to test with. I'm not going to try and use swords or even longer pole type weapons or anything like that for the moment. Because I don't want to damage the load cell in any way. So we'll go straight to the testing section and we'll see how they perform. So welcome to the testing section. I'm going to start up the software, and then I'm going to do 5 strikes with the flute, and I'll do 5 strikes with the Indian club, and then we'll take a snapshot of the output from the program, and we'll compare the results in the conclusion section. Just start the software. Okay, we'll stop that. Alright, I'll just finish up here, and then I'll see you in the conclusion section where we'll discuss the results. Welcome to the conclusion section of the video. So, to sum up the results from the testing, when I was using the flute to perform those strikes, my peak value was around 3,551 newtons. With the Indian club, it was a little bit lower. It was about 3,216 newtons. And the averages were also roughly the same kind of difference between the averages. Now, when you compare those values for both the flute and for the Indian club, to the value that I achieved recently with my backfist, which was the peak force was 5,467 newtons. There's a significant difference between those values, and not in the favor of the weapons. So, as I said, not everyone, but many people would assume that striking with a weapon would produce more force. Now, of course, I was only using one-handed weapons in the test. I didn't use two-handed weapons or weapons of considerable mass. Obviously, the results would vary depending on the type of weapon that you use, and there are many different weapons to achieve many different results. Generally speaking, weapons were used or are used for a number of different purposes. They achieve a number of different results, and these results include being used as force multipliers. So you could envision that that with a longer weapon, you might be able to get more leverage when you're doing your movements. So let's say a pole or perhaps a long spear. You might be able to get more leverage behind your movement and produce more force. In addition, weapons were used, and this is something that's not always given its proper credit. Weapons were also used to increase range. So having a longer range in hand-to-hand combat can be a huge advantage. It can actually disallow other shorter weapons from getting within range while you're still able to strike your opponent effectively. So it's quite an advantage to have a longer ranged weapon. In addition, weapons were used as pressure multipliers, so to increase the amount of pressure that you can produce. They're also used as energy storage devices. So if you can imagine lifting a heavy weapon up, you're actually injecting potential energy, which then becomes kinetic energy as you reverse the swing. And of course, there again with heavier weapons, when you put energy into the system as it's swinging, you're essentially adding your energy to the energy of the weapon as it swings. It becomes like an instantaneous energy storage device, which then delivers that energy in kinetic energy on impact. Weapons were also used to increase the speed at which you could move. So if you can imagine a long lever like weapon, like potentially a spear, if you're moving the spear at a particular velocity at the point that's closer to the fulcrum, the tip is going to be moving significantly faster than that because it's further away from you. In addition, weapons are also used as psychological intimidation tools. So those are all very important aspects of a weapon. And as I said, I've only used single-handed weapons in the test. So why the huge disparity between the amount of force that I could produce with a one-handed weapon as opposed to just swinging my fist? Well, first of all, I want to just mention the concepts that I mentioned earlier in relation to weapons: energy, force, and pressure. Now, there've been quite a few people who've gotten a bit hot under the collar about some of the videos that I've put out, and there've been some rather silly arguments about things such as force, pressure, and energy. And I believe that there's a lot of ignorance as to what those quantities really are in terms of the physical sciences, and what they're not. They are related quantities, but they are not the same. So when we talk about force, for instance, the equation for force is mass times acceleration. If we talk about kinetic energy, the equation to calculate kinetic energy is half mass times velocity squared. So mass is part of that equation, but velocity is as well. So velocity is not the same as acceleration. And when we talk about pressure, we're actually talking about force per unit area, which is different to force on its own. The load cell doesn't measure pressure. and it doesn't measure kinetic energy. It only looks at force produced. So in this case, instantaneous force of an impact. So those values are all different, and you have to be pretty specific about what you're talking about. And in this case, we are only talking about force. We're not talking about kinetic energy. We're not extrapolating kinetic energy from it, and we're not, I should say, we're not measuring kinetic energy. We're not measuring pressure. Those are different things. We're just looking at the force. We can make some, we can draw some conclusions about those other two values for those the weapons that I did the tests with, but we haven't actually measured those quantities. They are different. So why the massive difference between my barehand strike, my backfist, and a weapon? Well, I would say that in my case, it's because the kinetic chain that I'm using to produce force and kinetic energy starts to break down as it gets further and further away from my body. So if you can imagine that I'm producing a lot of force in my body, there are certain weak points, which are essentially the joints of the system, where that force can potentially break down, where energy is potentially lost in the system. And in this case, because I was using a one-handed weapon, the primary weakness there really is my wrist, because my wrist, it's really difficult to actually communicate that kind of force effectively through small joints. And that's a reflection of my level of skill, because there's a whole spectrum of skill levels here, and certain people are more effective at communicating that force, something that we call bridging in traditional martial arts. Some people are a lot more effective at bridging that force out and producing more kinetic energy and force than I'm able to do. So I'm at a particular level, and there are others who are better at it than I am. So based on that, why would I even want to pick up a weapon in the first place? Well, as I said, there are a lot of things that weapons are useful for. And in this case, one of the things that's overlooked, because they're not edged weapons, is a short pole or a club's ability to concentrate force at a particular area. So in other words, to improve the amount of pressure that you can introduce into a system. So if you can imagine taking 10 newtons and applying 10 newtons over 1 square meter of area, that's hardly going to do much at all to something. But if you take that same 10 newtons and you apply it onto the point of a pin, that's going to do a lot more damage to something that it's pressing against, because it's concentrating that force into a very small area. So when I'm striking with my fist, let's say I'm punching with my fist, it's got a fairly large surface area, and when I'm striking with the back of my arm, it's an even bigger surface area that force is spread over. If you take a rod like the Chinese flute that I was using against the force plate, the area over which that force is communicated is much smaller. So the pressure, and therefore potentially the amount of damage that you do to an object when you strike it, is seriously increased. In addition, my arm is made out of soft elements, so I've got muscle and skin and fat in my arm, and all of those have a lot of water in them. It's a soft substance. Even my fist, which after years of conditioning is still not, it's not made out of iron, regardless of what some people might claim on the internet. It's still going to be made out of flesh, and that is softer, so it has a certain amount of give to it when you strike something with it. Whereas a short pole, like the flute that I was using, or the Indian club for that matter, is a lot more rigid, so it doesn't absorb much of that energy and that force as it's impacting. Most of that is actually injected into the target. And of course, for all of the other reasons that I mentioned, things like extending range, improving energy storage and delivery systems, increasing the amount, potentially increasing the speed of your movement, and the psychological intimidation factor of a weapon. All of those are very important reasons, and reasons why potentially you would want to use a weapon rather than punching somebody with your fist, even though you might be able to produce more impact force with your fist because you've trained and you've refined your kinetic chain to the point where you can produce a lot of force at a point. You would still potentially want to pick up a weapon because of the other advantages that a weapon can give you. And of course, what I haven't mentioned yet as well is the whole idea of trained versus untrained. An untrained person generally doesn't have a very effective or efficient kinetic chain methodology or way of moving and way of producing force, which means that generally, if you take people off the street and you test how much force they can produce in a strike, it's generally pretty low. But if you gave them for instance, a baseball bat and asked them to swing it, there's a sort of an intuitive understanding of how to concentrate force and kinetic energy into that strike, which makes it easier for the average person who hasn't had any training to make effective use of a simple weapon. So if we're talking about it within that perspective, picking up a weapon, especially for someone who is untrained, makes them significantly more effective than they would have been without the weapon as well. So I hope you found this of interest. It's a bit of a long-winded discussion. There's a lot more that you can add to this, but what I really wanted to do is to just put out there that things are not as cut and dried as some people would like to think or like to make out. And of course, as I said, you can potentially use weapons to multiply the amount of force that you can produce, but those weapons would generally be the longer weapons, or weapons that allow you, or using weapons where you're actually using both hands on the weapon and using a lot of recruitment, essentially, recruiting more of your body's movement to produce more force. All right, thanks. I hope you enjoyed that. I'll see you next time.